Welcome to Top Stories Hub. Today we've got a new story, a mystery you'll want to unravel. This audition is strictly for serious artists, ma'am, the front desk clerk snapped, her eyes glued to her clipboard. Sophie Bennett stood firm, her weathered notebook of original scores clasped tightly, her voice steady and composed. "I've come to perform," she stated simply. Her tattered jacket drew snickers from the crowd. Her worn-out sneakers sparked cruel chuckles. They pegged her as someone's secretary, not a contender. Yet, the instant her fingers grazed the piano keys, time seemed to stand still. When her final chord faded, the entire audience rose, trembling with admiration and guilt. This is the riveting tale of a soft-spoken woman who slipped under everyone's radar until her melodies etched her name in their hearts forever. Now, before we dig deeper, hit that subscribe button on our channel. We bring you heartfelt, inspiring stories like this daily, so leave a comment letting us know where you're tuning in from. Thanks a bunch. Let's jump back into the story. "Only seasoned musicians can audition here, ma'am," the registration clerk barked, her gaze fixed on her paperwork, voice sharp as a whip. Her dismissive tone, honed to brush off nuisances like pesky vendors, carried a cold, practiced edge. Family and visitors wait outside the performance hall. Sophie Bennett blinked once, unflinched. "I'm not here as anyone's guest," she said softly. "I'm auditioning." Her words made the clerk pause, lifting her eyes slowly. Her polished nails hovered over a checkmark as she took in the woman before her, a lady in her early 40s, dressed plainly in a faded charcoal coat, simple black slacks, and shoes that had seen better days. Her chestnut hair was tied back neatly, the wisps at her temples frayed gently, like pages softened by years. In her hands, Sophie cradled a battered notebook, its corners curled, the cover nearly worn through, a treasure she held with the quiet reverence others reserved for heirlooms or dreams. The clerk's brows arched in disbelief. "You." Murmurs buzzed behind her. Other hopefuls, youthful, impeccably styled, their faces radiant with confidence and subtle conceit, started to take notice. A girl draped in a silk shawl elbowed her companion with a smirk. A lanky guy with a pianist's hands stifled a laugh behind a sleek face mask. Sophie nodded serenely. "I'm contestant number 27. The clerk faltered, then flicked her eyes back to the list. There it was, number 27, Sophie Bennett. Her signature, her time slot, a legitimate entry. Still, the clerk's lips curled into a tight, skeptical grimace. "Fine," she said curtly, grabbing a name tag. "Take a seat. We'll call your number." With a gentle nod, Sophie moved toward the plush benches along the hall's edge, her steps soft yet resolute, as if rooted in quiet conviction. As she passed, she felt their stares prickling like ants marching across her skin. The whispers grew bolder. "Is she for real? She looks like the janitor. Probably some amateur who tinkers at reunions. Bet she'll mangle some Chopin. Per grand piano." Their words didn't wound her. They drifted by like chilly breezes. Sophie had endured harsher slights in her time, far worse. Still, the moment stirred echoes of old pains she thought she'd buried beneath years of resilience and unspoken dreams. She settled at the bench's far end, distant from the clique of students basking in the chandelier's golden glow. Opening her notebook carefully, she revealed a patchwork of handwritten scores, some pages scrawled with marginal notes, others faintly yellowed by time and spilled tea. Inside the cover, in faded ink, a message read, "Play for those who never heard your song." Her late husband had penned it the night before his tragic accident, nearly a decade ago. The auditorium doors swung open and shut. Names echoed, claps swelled and faded. Some delivered flawless performances, their fingers slicing through notes with surgical precision, yet their music felt empty, like chimes missing their resonance. The judges, a prestigious panel of music school luminaries, jotted notes in silence, their expressions often flat or faintly weary. A rare nod, an occasional "thank you." Most acts glided through the space like courteous specters, noticed, heard, then swiftly forgotten. Sophie waited patiently. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, except for the gentle stroke of her thumb along the notebook's edge, a gesture like a whispered prayer or a beat only she could feel. Then came the call, number 27, Sophie Bennett. A murmur rippled through the students, like a breeze stirring tall grass. One girl stifled giggles behind her score sheets. The lanky guy from before muttered, "Time for the comedy break." She rose. Her quiet steps down the center aisle rang louder than any ovation. The judges glanced up. One squinted curiously. Another leaned toward the lead judge, whispering something. He furrowed his brow but gave a slight nod. Sophie reached the grand piano on stage and offered a subtle bow to the panel. Then she faced the instrument. It loomed larger than she recalled, its glossy black surface shimmering like polished stone. As she sat, her fingers brushed its frame lightly as if reconnecting with a long-lost companion. The bench sighed softly beneath her as she adjusted her position. No grand flourishes, no dramatic toss of hair or cuffs, just a moment of calm, a single breath. She set her notebook on the music stand, opening it to a page labeled Whispers at Dawn Dash. One judge gripped his pen, poised to critique. The others made no effort to mask their doubt. Then her hands met the keys. It wasn't a thunderous burst of chords or a dizzying cascade of scales. The sound began softly, almost tentative, a delicate thread of 3 notes repeating like footprints in fresh snow. A second melody joined, tender and exploratory, as if someone were navigating a misty morning, hesitant yet hopeful. The audience held their laughter. The music didn't fit their image of her. It wasn't merely lovely, it was spellbinding, each phrase laced with a quiet ache, each pause heavy with unspoken stories. Her left hand wove shadows while her right hand reached for glimmers of light. As the piece unfolded, its truth emerged. This was more than music. It was a tapestry of memory, yearning, sorrow, and joy woven into a single, luminous thread of sound. A girl in the back row paused her texting, her phone forgotten. A boy's smug grin melted away. One judge lowered his pen, stunned. They braced for a farce. Instead, they heard a soul laid bare. Sophie's shoulders remained steady, but her fingers moved with a subdued intensity. The middle section swelled like sunlight piercing storm clouds, its crescendos rolling in gentle yet profound waves, followed by a startling shift in key, bold, unexpected, yet perfectly fitting. It evoked the moment someone pivots their life's path after years of wandering in loops. Then came a softening, a quiet return to those first 3 notes, now transformed, carrying the weight of all that came before: pain, grace, redemption. It wasn't a cycle, it was a journey completed. She closed with a lingering chord, letting it hover, inviting the room to dwell in its resonance, then silence. Sophie lifted her hands, resting them softly in her lap. No one stirred. No one dared. It was as if the piano had shared a sacred secret and they feared shattering it with a breath. The lead judge leaned back, blinking slowly, his gaze fixed not on his notes but on her, seeing her anew. Sophie stood, offered a small nod, and turned to leave the stage. Her steps remained unchanged, soft, resolute, but the room's atmosphere had shifted like the calm after a sudden downpour. She reached the exit when a voice broke through. "Hold on." One of the judges spoke, his tone quivering faintly. "Did you compose that piece?" Sophie turned, a faint smile touching her lips. "Yes," she replied. "Every single note." Gasps fluttered through the crowd. A few waiting performers straightened, chastened. The lanky guy who'd mocked her earlier stared at the floor, humbled. The judge pressed on, stunned. "How have we never heard of you?" Sophie glanced at her tattered notebook, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because no one ever invited me to share my music." Her footsteps echoed softly as she left the stage, but the silence she left behind hung thick, like mist over a still lake. Sophie didn't need to look back to sense the change. Like a fragile vase cracked but not yet collapsed. Behind her, the audience sat frozen, grappling with the contrast between the woman they'd ridiculed and the music that had just moved them. She reached the waiting area, where the plush benches no longer felt so foreign. The clerk who dismissed her earlier stood rigid, eyes wide, lips parted as she struggled for words. Sophie offered a polite nod, not pausing. "I had no idea," the clerk finally blurted, her voice shaky. Sophie stopped, turning to meet her gaze, kind yet unwavering, like a breeze against an ancient oak. "Most don't," she said gently. "That's the whole point." She continued on, leaving the desk, the murmurs, and the sneers in her wake. Backstage, the other contestants fell unusually silent. The lanky guy who jeered now stared at his hands, his bravado gone. One girl gripped her score sheets like a lifeline. Another offered Sophie a hesitant smile, a belated gesture of respect that felt hollow. For Sophie, the audition hadn't merely concluded. It had reshaped the expectations of everyone present. The standard had been raised, not through technique or prestige, but through raw, undeniable spirit that reverberated through the hall. In the judge's room, the panel sat in stunned silence. No one reached for the next evaluation form. The chief judge, James Carter, renowned in classical circles for his cold precision and unrelenting standards, slipped off his glasses and exhaled, as if emerging from a deep dive. "I'm at a loss for words," he murmured, his voice tinged with rare vulnerability. Next to him, Judge Abigail Reed nodded slowly. She didn't just perform that piece. She poured her life into it. It was her own creation, the third judge added. She claimed she wrote it, and I believe her. Who else crafts music with such raw, emotional depth these days? Carter sat quiet for a moment, then tapped his pen lightly on the table. Fetch her file for me. The clerk, now flustered, hurried over and handed him a slim folder labeled with Sophie's name. Inside were just 2 pages, her application and a handwritten note attached to the back. He turned to the note and read it softly aloud. I may not fit the mold of your typical candidate, but if music is about honesty, let me share mine. I don't seek validation, just one chance to be heard. The judges lingered in the weight of those words. Outside, Sophie stepped into the crisp air, the late afternoon sun casting golden rays across the conservatory's stone courtyard. She paused, closing her eyes to let the warmth kiss her face. It had been years since she stood in a place like this, surrounded by grand pillars, elegant attire, polished marble, and manicured shrubs. Yet, even after her performance, a small part of her braced for someone to ask her to leave, haunted by old rejections that still whispered in her mind. Sophie drew her coat closer around her and strolled unhurriedly toward the campus's edge. The bus stop lay a mile off, but she didn't mind the trek. She savored the stillness, though just before she reached the wrought iron gate, the sound of hurried steps echoed behind her. Ms. Bennett, hold on a moment. She turned to see Judge Emily Harris, one of the panelists, hurrying toward her, slightly winded from the chase. In her hands was Sophie's well-worn notebook of compositions. You left this behind, Emily said, extending it toward her. Sophie took it gently, as if it were a cherished relic passed down through generations. Thank you, she replied softly. I rarely misplace it. Emily paused, then met Sophie's gaze with earnest intensity. I have to tell you, that was one of the most authentic performances I've ever witnessed. You didn't just play notes. You carried us to a place that felt profoundly true. A faint smile warmed Sophie's face, touched by the sincerity. It was genuine. Every chord, every stumble, every breath. It all came from the life I've lived. Emily's brow creased slightly, her voice gentle. You didn't falter once. Sophie let out a quiet chuckle. Not on the keys, maybe, but life's handed me plenty of missteps. That's what fuels my music. For a moment, they stood bathed in the afternoon light, 2 women shaped by vastly different paths, one molded by grand concert halls and global stages, the other by dim church basements and late-night sessions on borrowed pianos. Yet, in that quiet pause, no divide existed, only mutual admiration. I hope you'll stay with us, Emily said at last. You could transform this place. Sophie's eyes softened, her voice steady. I didn't come to overhaul it, just to nudge it back to what matters. Emily nodded, her eyes glistening as she blinked back emotion. I think you've managed both. Sophie watched her retreat toward the conservatory, then turned back to the path ahead. The notebook pressed against her chest, its weight like a steady pulse. The long bus ride home loomed, as did her evening shift at the hospital cafeteria, but something within her had stirred, like a window nudged open after years of being sealed shut. Inside the conservatory, the echoes of her performance still reverberated. Students tapped away at their phones, spreading the word. One had captured her final minute on video and shared it online, where it racked up over 200,000 views in just an hour. Comments poured in. Who is she? I'm in tears. This hit me harder than anything since my grandpa's passing. She played the emotions I've carried for a decade but could never name. The footage was unpolished, a bit wobbly, but the raw feeling in the room poured through the screen. The internet didn't care about her plain clothes, her age, or her lack of conservatory credentials. It heard only honesty, and a world hungry for truth devoured it. In a lofty office above the main rehearsal space, James Carter sat at a broad oak desk, still poring over the notebook Emily had returned to him. He turned page after page of meticulously handwritten music, each line vibrant with precision and life. Under his breath, he murmured, "How did we overlook her?" Deep down, he knew why. They'd never bothered to look. As evening fell softly, like a curtain drifting to the floor, Sophie boarded a nearly empty city bus. The warm air inside hummed with the faint drone of tires on pavement. She settled into a seat near the back, just past the rear door, her notebook nestled in her lap like a precious keepsake. She didn't glance out the window yet. Her gaze lingered on the frayed edges of the leather cover, her fingers tracing the cracked seams. The feel of the piano keys still pulsed in her hands, like the fading rumble of a storm long gone. The driver stole a quick glance at her in the rearview mirror, perhaps intrigued by the woman in the long gray coat who seemed to carry the air of somewhere significant, but he asked nothing. Only the soft creak of the doors folding shut marked her arrival. Beyond the bus, the city churned on. A kid pedaled by, a grocery bag swinging precariously from his bike's handlebars. Two men bickered outside a pawn shop. A nurse in scrubs slumped against a bus stop pole, her eyes heavy with fatigue. The city remained oblivious to the extraordinary moment that had just unfolded within the conservatory's walls. For now, the world moved forward, unaware, as it often did. Sophie didn't mind too much. She'd long grown accustomed to brilliance blooming in the shadows. When she reached her home, an old duplex nestled behind a shuttered bookstore, she paused on the bottom step. The porch light flickered weakly overhead, casting wavering shadows across the peeling railing and a pot of wilting chrysanthemums she hadn't yet discarded. Inside, her apartment was modest but spotless. A pile of vintage records rested against a dusty shelf. A simple frame above her weathered upright piano held a photo of her late husband, Michael, and next to it a smaller one of her son, Ethan, in his military uniform, his smile radiating a pride that stirred both warmth and sorrow in her heart. She slipped off her coat, hung it carefully, and approached the piano. It hadn't been tuned in years, but that didn't matter. Lifting the fallboard, she pressed a single key, coaxing out a tired D, slightly flat, a bit muted but true. A small smile crossed her lips as she sat and began to play, not to perform or dazzle, but to reconnect with her memories. The music was gentle, wandering, incomplete, a piece born in the quiet moments between work and morning, one of many she'd crafted alone. It had no name, only a feeling, tied to words she'd spoken to Michael the night before his funeral. "I'll keep playing, even if it's just for me." But now, someone had listened, and the air around her felt changed. Morning arrived cloaked in mist. Sleep had eluded her, the audition replaying in her mind. Not as a triumph, but as something dreamlike, as if it belonged to someone else's story. She poured coffee into the chipped blue mug Michael always loved and checked her phone. 12 missed calls, 3 voicemails, over 100 messages. At first, she thought it was an error, but her inbox told a different story. "We watched your performance. Can we interview you? Would you perform at our autumn gala?" The video had exploded online overnight, amassing over 2 million views in under a day. A tweet from a famous cellist, an email from an NPR producer. A young pianist from Brazil messaged, "I watched your video with my mom. We both wept. Thank you for reminding me why I play." Sophie sat at her small kitchen table, steam rising from her coffee as she read the comments. Each one like a foreign tongue she instinctively understood. She'd always known music held power, but not like this, not so swift, not so resounding. That day, she returned to her shift at the hospital cafeteria, her uniform faintly scented with bleach. The hairnet always pinched at her scalp, but she wore it regardless. Routine grounded her in a world that suddenly felt unsteady, as if the ground beneath her had begun to tilt. In the lunch line, a nurse froze, tray in hand, and blinked at her. "Hang on. Are you the woman from that piano video?" Sophie offered a gentle smile. "I guess that's me." The nurse stared, awestruck, as if seeing a vision. "You're playing." "It felt like reliving a memory," she said at last. "It brought my grandmother back to me." Sophie said nothing, but her smile grew. Not proud, but woven from quiet affirmation. The day blurred with soft gasps of recognition and whispered exchanges. When her shift ended, she slipped out the back door, not to vanish, but to catch her breath. That evening, her landline buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but something urged her to pick up. "Ms. Bennett," a crisp, British-accented male voice announced. "This is Dr. William Hayes, speaking for the London Philharmonic. Your performance caught our eye, and we'd love for you to create a new piece for us." Sophie's grip on the phone tightened, her mind reeling as she questioned if she'd heard right. "You're asking me to compose for your winter showcase?" "Indeed," he replied. "A fresh composition, entirely yours, with complete orchestral backing and, naturally, payment for your work. A soft laugh escaped her, not from doubt, but from the surreal weight of such an offer while she sat on a thrift store sofa beside a rickety coffee table patched with duct tape. "I've never written for a full orchestra," she admitted with quiet candor. "Well, then, it's about time you gave it a go." Long after the call ended, Sophie sat motionless, her notebook resting in her lap, her gaze lost in the distance. She'd always crafted music for solo piano, partly because it was her comfort zone, but also because it was all she could access. The thought of her melodies soaring through violins, cellos, and trumpets, of an entire orchestra bringing her inner world to life, felt both daunting and breathtakingly beautiful. As night fell gently, like a velvet drape settling over the city, Sophie boarded a nearly deserted bus. The warm air inside buzzed faintly with the hum of tires on pavement. She claimed a seat near the back, just beyond the rear exit, her notebook cradled in her lap like a cherished heirloom. She hadn't yet glanced out the window. Her eyes traced the frayed edges of the leather cover, her fingers brushing the worn stitching. The sensation of the piano keys lingered in her hands, reverberating like the echo of a storm that had long since passed. The driver flicked a curious glance at her in the rearview mirror, perhaps intrigued by the woman in the long gray coat who seemed to carry the weight of somewhere significant, but he stayed silent. Only the soft creak of the doors closing marked her presence. Outside, the city pulsed with life. A boy pedaled past, a grocery bag dangling precariously from his bike's handlebars. Two men bickered outside a pawn shop. A nurse in scrubs slumped against a bus stop pole, her eyes heavy with weariness. The city remained unaware of the extraordinary moment that had just unfolded within the walls of Harmony Conservatory. For now, the world carried on, oblivious as it often did. Sophie didn't mind too much. She'd grown accustomed to brilliance unfolding in the quiet corners of life. When she reached her home, an aging duplex tucked behind a shuttered bookstore, she lingered briefly on the bottom step. The porch light flickered weakly above, casting shifting shadows across the peeling railing and a pot of wilted chrysanthemums she hadn't yet mustered the heart to discard. Inside, her apartment was small but pristine. A stack of old vinyl records rested against a dusty shelf. Above her weathered upright piano hung a simple frame with a photo of her late husband, David, and beside it a smaller one of her son, Noah, in his military uniform, his smile radiating a pride that stirred both joy and a tender ache in her chest. She slipped off her coat, hung it with care, and approached the piano. It hadn't been tuned in years, but that didn't matter. Lifting the fallboard, she pressed a single key, coaxing out a tired D, slightly off, a bit muted, but honest. A faint smile crossed her lips as she sat and began to play, not to dazzle or perform, but to reconnect with her memories. The music was soft, wandering, incomplete, a piece born in the quiet moments between work and grief, one of many she'd crafted in solitude. It had no name, only a feeling tied to words she'd whispered to David the night before his funeral. "I'll keep playing, even if no one's there to listen." But now someone had heard, and the air around her felt alive with possibility. Morning arrived cloaked in a soft fog. Sleep had slipped through her fingers, the audition replaying in her mind, not as a triumph, but as something otherworldly, like a vision meant for someone else. She poured coffee into the chipped blue mug David had always cherished and checked her phone. 12 missed calls, 3 voicemails, over 100 messages. At first, she thought it was a glitch, but her inbox told a different story. "Your performance moved us. Can we talk about an interview? Would you perform at our autumn showcase?" The video had exploded online overnight, amassing over 2 million views in less than a day, a post from a renowned cellist, an email from an NPR producer. A young pianist from Brazil wrote, "I watched your video with my mom. We both wept. You reminded me why I play." Sophie sat quietly at her modest kitchen table, steam curling from her coffee as she read the comments, each one like a foreign language she instinctively understood. She'd always known music carried power, but not like this, not so swift, not so resounding. That day, she returned to her shift at the hospital cafeteria, her uniform faintly scented with bleach. The hairnet always pinched at her scalp, but she wore it anyway. Routine anchored her in a world that suddenly felt unsteady, as if the ground beneath her was shifting. In the lunch line, a nurse froze, tray hovering, and blinked at her. "Hold on, are you the woman from that piano video?" Sophie offered a gentle smile. "I guess that's me." The nurse stared, awestruck, as if seeing a vision. "You're playing, it felt like reliving a memory," she said at last. "It brought my grandmother back to me." Sophie said nothing, but her smile deepened, not proud, but woven from quiet affirmation. The day blurred with soft gasps of recognition and whispered exchanges. When her shift ended, she slipped out the back door, not to vanish, but to catch her breath. That evening, her landline buzzed. The number was unfamiliar, but something urged her to pick up. Ms. Bennett, a crisp, British-accented male voice announced. "This is Dr. William Hayes, speaking for the London Philharmonic. Your performance caught our eye, and we'd love for you to create a new piece for us." Sophie's grip on the phone tightened, her mind reeling as she questioned if she'd heard right. "You're asking me to compose for your winter showcase?" "Indeed," he replied. "A fresh composition, entirely yours, with complete orchestral backing and, naturally, payment for your work." A soft laugh escaped her, not from doubt but from the surreal weight of such an offer while she sat on a thrift store sofa beside a rickety coffee table patched with duct tape. "I've never written for a full orchestra," she admitted with quiet candor. "Well, then it's about time you gave it a go." Long after the call ended, Sophie sat motionless, her notebook resting in her lap, her gaze lost in the distance. She'd always crafted music for solo piano, partly because it was her comfort zone, but also because it was all she could access. The thought of her melodies soaring through violins, cellos, and trumpets, of an entire orchestra bringing her inner world to life, felt both daunting and breathtakingly beautiful. That night, she pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began to compose. The piece didn't open with grandeur. It started with a single, lingering note held just a moment too long. A pause, a breath of tension. Then the strings entered softly, persistent, like a long-forgotten memory clawing its way back. She named it Legacy Dash. It wasn't just for her, but for all those told to stay silent, to shrink their brilliance into polite, hidden notebooks. For every worker with calloused hands who could still craft beauty. For the custodian humming symphonies, the mother whose lullabies rivaled operas, the church musician scribbling notes in the margins of hymnals. Her story had grown into something bigger, a requiem, a rebellion. Snow-dusted Harmony Conservatory lightly, cloaking the iron gates in a quiet veil of white. By dawn, the grand entrance was cleared, marble steps gridded, banners swaying gently above an arch proclaiming, "Winter Gala Performance." This annual event drew the school's finest to perform for critics, donors, and talent scouts from around the world. But this year, one name on the program sparked more buzz than any other: Sophie Bennett, original work, Legacy Dash. Her name wasn't in bold, yet nearly every guest had circled it in red ink. Inside the hall, beneath a soaring chandelier, the audience hummed with restless anticipation. Patrons fiddled with their opera glasses. Journalists lingered along the aisles, cameras ready. No one said it aloud, but most had seen the viral video, now at over 12 million views, a woman who'd entered an audition like a forgotten shadow and played with the fire of a legend, now granted the grand stage. Backstage, Sophie stood alone in a plain black dress, no designer tags or sparkling jewels, just grace woven into quiet dignity. The conductor, a silver-haired man named Henry Walsh, approached with cautious awe. "They're expecting something explosive," he said. Sophie didn't flinch. "Let them feel its warmth or its burn." Walsh's lips curved faintly, rattled by her calm. "Are you prepared? My whole life has led to this." The orchestra had rehearsed her piece for 2 weeks. At first, some musicians were dubious, her notation lacked the showy flourishes or daring tempos they expected. But when they played it through, a rare thing happened. Silence followed the final note, not from confusion or critique, but from reverence. Now, they settled into their seats under the stage lights, instruments gleaming and ready. Walsh raised his baton and Sophie stepped onto the stage. The air shifted with her presence. A few gasped, recognizing her. Others murmured, still braced for disappointment. She moved slowly, purposefully, notebook in hand, and placed it on the stand of the waiting grand piano. No bow, just a nod before she sat. The conductor paused. Then the downbeat fell like a decree of destiny. The piece began with a lone cello, its low, quivering voice recalling a memory too painful to speak. Violins followed, fragile and tentative, threading between doubt and hope. Then the piano entered, not with force, but with a quiet weight, as if the keys were whispering long-held secrets. Sophie's hands were steady, each note unfolding like a confession scrawled in the margins of lost pages. The orchestra answered her, not as a backdrop, but as a mirror, sometimes challenging, sometimes embracing, always in dialogue. In the balcony, a renowned composer leaned forward, lips parted in awe. In the front rows, a critic known for brutal reviews let his pen slip to the floor. The music told a story no one had sought, but everyone craved, a tale of silence, of being unseen, of carrying genius in your arms while others mistook you for a shadow. A moment in the second movement hushed the room to a breathless pause. Strings rose in aching minor chord as the piano sank beneath, like a woman bowing in quiet prayer while the world hurried past. Then came light, a shift to a major key, not victorious, but hard one, like a window cracked open in winter, letting in the faint song of birds after a snowstorm. Sophie played without flourish, without theatrics. She didn't chase applause. She offered something rawer, something that declared, I was never invisible. You just didn't see me. The final note lingered, trembling like an unanswered question suspended in the air. Then came silence, not emptiness, but the weight of what had been. She lifted her hands, resting them gently in her lap, and looked out, not at the glittering chandeliers, the critics, or the gilded walls, but at the ordinary people, those who never expected her to stand here, those who were her in some hidden way. Slowly they stood. Not the rote ovation of formal concerts, but a deep, deliberate rise as if honoring something beyond music, the burden of years, the erasure undone in one performance. Backstage, the conductor brushed tears from his eyes. He'd led works by composers with monuments to their names, but tonight, the cafeteria worker had redefined the meaning of a stage. Sophie left the stage quietly, no wave, no smile, just a stillness, like a cathedral door easing shut. In the wings, a young girl with braces and tangled hair watched her pass, no older than 14, clutching a violin case with peeling stickers. Barely audible, she whispered, "You made me believe I can do this too." Sophie stopped, her eyes meeting the girl's, then gently rested a hand on her shoulder. "You're already capable," she said softly. "The world just hasn't caught up to you yet." That evening, the reviews poured in like a flood. The New York Times declared the most genuine performance in a decade. The Guardian wrote, "Legacy by Sophie Bennett isn't just music, it's a sacred text." Chicago Tribune predicted her work will be studied in schools that once would have shut their doors to her. Back at her modest home, Sophie settled at her aging upright piano. No formal attire, no plush auditorium seats, just her, in her quiet space. During the intermission, her son, Noah, had called, his voice trembling over the phone from his overseas base where he'd watched the livestream. "Mom," he said, choking up, "they finally heard your voice?" She held back tears during the call. Only after hanging up did she lift the piano's lid, reaching inside to retrieve an old cassette tape, David's recording of her first composition, played on a borrowed church piano back when they were young, broke, and dared only to dream small. She pressed play. The sound was scratchy, off-key, but achingly real. Through the static, David's voice emerged, "You're going to shake the world someday." Closing her eyes, she murmured into the stillness, "It's beginning, love, just like you promised." Outside, snow drifted down once more. But within her home, everything had changed because true greatness doesn't always thunder. Sometimes it speaks softly through worn keys, overlooked applications, and a woman in a simple dress who played as if the world had never truly listened. Now it finally did. The snow had melted weeks ago. But the warmth Sophie Bennett left behind that night lingered, unyielding. In the days that followed, something remarkable unfolded, not just within the walls of Harmony Conservatory or the elite circles of classical music, but in unexpected corners where her name should have meant nothing. Subway buskers took up Legacy on their cellos. High school music instructors photocopied transcriptions from the viral video dissecting how her themes intertwined like time-worn hands clasped in comfort. In small churches, her name was spoken with reverence, a testament that holiness still lived in the everyday. Sophie didn't chase the spotlight. She barely noticed it. Her days stayed the same, early mornings, simple meals, and handwritten scores crafted in the soft glow of her kitchen. She kept her part-time job at the hospital cafeteria even as commissions rolled and that could have let her retire. To every offer, she gave the same reply, "I'm not done telling the story." One morning, as she wiped down tables, a young man in a light blue hoodie approached, his steps hesitant like he was out of place. "You're Ms. Bennett, right?" Sophie glanced up, sunlight glinting off the silver strands in her hair. "That's me." He shifted nervously. "I just had to tell you, your music changed how I see music, how I see life." Her smile was warm, inviting. "That's kind of you to say. Thank you." He paused, then added, "I'm studying composition at Harmony." That stopped her. He hurried to explain. "I wasn't at your performance, but I've watched the video 100 times. I printed your score and it got me writing again. I hadn't touched a note in a year, thinking I had nothing worth saying. But your music, it didn't shout. It just existed. It made me feel like it's okay to be quiet, like being small doesn't mean being meaningless." Sophie held his gaze for a long moment, her eyes gentle yet sharp. "Smallness," she said deliberately, "is where the soul takes root. It grows in stillness. And one day, if you nurture it, it will sing." He brushed away tears, nodding without words. Later, when she got home, a letter waited on her doorstep, no return address, just a crisp white envelope with her name in elegant, looping script. Inside, a single sheet read, "Sophie, we once rejected you without hearing a single note. That will forever be this institution's greatest error. On behalf of Harmony Conservatory with full board approval, we offer you a permanent role on our faculty, not merely as a teacher, but as a composer in residence, a beacon, a voice we should have heeded long ago." James Carter. She sat at her kitchen table, the letter spread before her for what felt like hours. Outside, the wind tapped the windows, a gentle nudge that time never stops moving. She thought back to her teenage application to Harmony, the curt rejection that offered no reason, only polished dismissal. She'd buried that hope so deep she'd forgotten its melody. Now it was resurrected, vibrant and alive. Yet she paused, not from uncertainty, but from the weight of the moment. She didn't want to enter that conservatory as a figure they'd belatedly celebrated. She wanted to step in as the same woman who'd faced that audition with raw truth, with scars, with music woven into her very being like a living tapestry. Her reply was a single line, "I'll join, but only if I can teach those no one expects." Weeks later, her first day as faculty came without pomp. She entered the classroom with a worn bag over her shoulder, a composition notebook, and a second-hand thermos of mint tea. The students eyed her with a mix of awe and curiosity. She didn't resemble any other professor. She didn't recite theory from textbooks or boast about mingling with famous composers. Instead, she flipped open her notebook, sketched a single staff line on the chalkboard, and asked, "What does silence sound like to you?" A long silence followed. Then a hand went up. A young girl with ink-smudged fingers said, "It's like the pause right before tears fall." Another hand, "It's the place where truth hides." Sophie nodded. "Exactly. Now write that. Don't make it polished. Make it real." Her class became the stuff of legend. She didn't drill scales or insist on rote memorization. She urged them to compose what frightened them, embraced their errors, and rejected imitation. Her students began creating works that stirred tears, sparked fury, and tugged at the heart. Competitions shifted from chasing trophies to seeking meaning. Slowly, Harmony transformed. In a space once reserved for pedigreed prodigies, students with scuffed shoes and second-hand keyboards started arriving, their dreams glowing like fragile flames. One, a boy from a Detroit housing project, composed a piece that moved a donor to tears, prompting her to double her scholarship fund. Another, a reserved transfer student who'd never spoken in class, wrote a choral piece later performed by a European cathedral choir. It all unfolded quietly, without fanfare or headlines, just ripples spreading outward. One afternoon, Sophie stood alone in the empty concert hall long after practice had ended. The lights were low, dust drifting through beams above the stage like faint echoes of past ovations. She sat at the grand piano, opened her notebook, and played a new piece, one not yet written, born not from memory but from the now. It started slowly, a lullaby for those overlooked. She pictured David in the front row, Noah beside him, home from deployment, their hands clasped. She envisioned every face that had turned away from her and then imagined them listening, really listening. In that moment, she knew this was her true stage. Not the viral fame or the ornate invitations, but this space where silenced voices were beginning to rise, shaky at first, then bold, then unstoppable. The world would hear them because it had no other choice. Sophie Bennett had rewritten the rules note by careful note. That evening, a gentle rain fell, a silvery mist softening the city's edges and cloaking the world in quiet murmurs. Sophie sat by her window, her hands curled around a ceramic mug adorned with delicate blue flowers, a rare keepsake from her mother. The house was still, save for the steady tick of the old clock above her piano and the patter of rain against the glass, like timid fingers seeking entry. She'd spent the day reviewing student compositions, their pages now stacked neatly beside her. Some were rough and tentative, others wild and unrestrained, but each carried the spark of something authentic, something she'd spent her life longing to hear. These weren't pieces crafted for praise. They were made to be felt. She shut her eyes. The melody she'd played earlier still resonated in her mind, unnamed but vivid, tugging at her heartstrings. Lately, her music had begun to shift. Once deeply personal, rooted in memories, loss, and quiet strength, it was now expanding, as if her notes were carrying not just her story but the voices of others, finding shelter in her chords. Her phone buzzed once, then again. She picked it up casually, glancing at the screen. A message from an unknown number read, "I heard your performance at Harmony last month. I hadn't composed in 12 years. Tonight, I picked up my pen again." Another, "I hope this reaches you. My daughter, deaf since last year, said she felt your music in her chest. She smiled for the first time in months." Sophie set the phone down slowly, her hands trembling, not from fear or shock, but from the overwhelming gift of grace. She walked to her piano, sat in the dim light, and rested her hands lightly on the keys, touching them with reverence, as if they might break under the weight of what they now held. Then she played, no score, no plan, just a gentle unfolding of her soul into sound. Outside, the rain grew stronger, tapping the roof in rhythm with her chords. In that quiet home, she was no longer alone. Her fingers now carried others, the silenced, the overlooked, the courageous, the wounded. Their stories had braided into hers, and her melodies were somehow answering them. The next morning, a letter arrived, its gold-embossed trim and National Music Foundation seal catching the light. It wasn't an invite, it was a nomination. Lifetime Contribution to American Music, nominee Sophie Bennett. The irony hit her first, before gratitude could settle in. A lifetime's work recognized after a lifetime of being ignored. She let out a soft chuckle, shaking her head at how the world sometimes arrived late, like snow in spring. Still, she accepted, not for the honor itself, but for what it symbolized, a long-locked door finally creaking open. That afternoon, she taught her class as usual, making no mention of the nomination. Instead, she asked, "What does a wound sound like to you?" The room grew still. A boy in the back murmured, like silence trying to pass as music. Another chimed in, like beauty holding back tears. Sophie nodded. "Write that. Don't aim for cleverness. Aim for truth." After class, a girl with a faint scar along her jawline lingered. She waited until the others left, then approached Sophie, clutching a folded sheet. "I wrote this after my mom passed," she said. "I never shared it. I thought it was too raw." Sophie unfolded the paper carefully, her eyes tracing the uneven melody, the stark dynamics, the delicate grace notes scrawled in shaky ink. She looked up. "This isn't raw," she said. "It's unfiltered truth, the kind of beauty that shakes the world." The girl blinked, a hesitant smile breaking through for the first time in weeks. "Would you play it?" she asked. Sophie didn't reply. She walked to the piano, set the sheet on the stand, and began. The empty room felt alive. The notes were halting, rough, sometimes jarring, but undeniably real. At the end, she left the melody unresolved, letting it linger, perfectly unfinished. The girl stood frozen, tears streaming silently. "I didn't think music could sound like that." Sophie placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "It can. And now it always will." In the weeks that followed, Sophie's home became a quiet haven for pilgrims, not in a grand sense, but in a humble, heartfelt way. Letters arrived daily. Students from distant schools sent recordings. A mother mailed drawings her kids made while listening to Sophie's music. A former soldier sent a dog tag with a note, "You reminded me why I fought to come back." One evening, as she cooked dinner, carrots and lentils bubbling on the stove, the phone rang. A familiar voice came through. "Sophie, it's James." She hadn't heard from Carter since her faculty appointment. His tone now held a humility she hadn't noticed before, stripped of its old arrogance. "I've got an unusual request." "I'm listening," she said. "We're dedicating the new recital wing next month. We'd like to name it after you." The silence that followed wasn't from shock, but from a deeper realization. The girl once turned away from Harmony's gates for not fitting their mold was now being carved into its legacy. She let out a quiet breath. "No," Sophie said firmly. James Carter paused, caught off guard. "No? I don't need my name carved on a building," she answered. "But I'll tell you what I do want." "I'm all ears," he replied. "I want scholarships for kids who've never touched a piano. I want auditions that are open, anonymous, judged purely on the music. I want a seat on your admissions board. And I want a space where anyone can play anytime, day or night, no credentials, no fancy clothes, just keys and freedom." A brief silence hung between them, followed by a heavy exhale. "It's yours," he said. That night, Sophie sat at her piano again, but this time she began with stillness, letting it bloom into a melody she couldn't yet define. It unfolded slowly, like a sigh after a broken heart. It surged with courage, then softened into fragility. It cracked, only to weave itself whole mid-phrase. It wasn't the sound of victory, it was the sound of fairness, hard-earned and undeniable. Deep within its structure, threaded into the very soul of the music, echoed the quiet reverberations of a life spent invisible. No more. Dawn broke gently, painting Harmony Conservatory's glass roof with the tender glow of spring. Budding trees in the courtyard quivered with new life, and students trickled into the stone building, notebooks tucked under their arms, melodies dancing in their minds. Yet, for all its visual splendor, the real change at Harmony wasn't in its architecture or gleaming marble halls, it was in the music. Gone were the lifeless recitals, the robotic showcases of technical prowess. Now the air carried stories, authentic, human stories. You could hear it in the practice rooms where shaky fingers dared to test unfinished works. You could sense it in the pauses between notes where silence itself seemed alive with intention. At the heart of this shift stood Sophie Bennett, composer-in-residence, teacher, and the unassuming catalyst of a revolution no one saw coming. That morning, Sophie arrived early, as always. No sleek briefcase or laptop, just a weathered leather satchel older than half her students. She glided through the corridors with a quiet confidence that needed no grand gestures. Her mere presence commanded attention. Students glanced up as she passed, some offered shy nods, others watched in silent awe, still grappling with how to approach a woman who'd reshaped their view of music with one performance. Her office, a small nook by the library wing, brimmed with student scores, tattered composition journals, and a kettle for brewing tea. No trophies adorned the walls, no photos boasted of galas or the renowned artists she'd quietly worked with in recent months. The only adornment was a framed quote above her piano, scrawled in faded ink on aging paper: "True greatness lies not in being noticed, but in noticing others." David had jotted it on a church bulletin the night she first shared "Whispers at Dawn" with him. He called her a genius. She'd laughed it off. Now, the world had finally caught up to his vision. As she prepped her lesson, a soft knock sounded at the door. "Come in," she called, her voice warm and inviting. The door creaked open, revealing a familiar face, Lily Chin, a talented young pianist who'd once quit competitions crippled by stage fright. She hadn't played for 2 years until Sophie's class rekindled her spark. "I hope I'm not interrupting," Lily said, clutching a folder tightly to her chest. "Never," Sophie replied. "What brings you here so early?" Lily stepped forward and offered the folder. "It's the piece I mentioned, the one I thought I'd never complete." Sophie took it gently, flipping to the first page to study the notation. Her brows rose slightly. The melody was unconventional, broken, uneven. The harmonies jarred in surprising ways, yet there was an undeniable strength to it, a controlled chaos that knew its destination. "What's it about?" Sophie asked. Lily hesitated. "The year I nearly vanished. When I stopped eating, when no one saw." Sophie looked up slowly, her voice soft. "I understand. I don't care if people like it," Lily added quickly. "I just want them to hear it." Sophie nodded. "Then you've already won." She handed the folder back. "I want you to perform this at the spring recital." Lily's eyes widened, panic flashing across her face. I can't." "You can," Sophie said gently, cutting in. "It doesn't need to be flawless. It just needs to be honest." That afternoon, as rain pattered softly against the conservatory's windows, Sophie sat alone in the vast rehearsal hall. The echoes of student chatter and footsteps had faded as the last of them left for the day. She remained at the grand piano, hands still, breath even. Before her lay the beginnings of a new piece, blank pages, empty staves. She gazed at them, unblinking. For the first time in months, a strange feeling crept into her mind, not fear, not doubt, but something deeper, more elusive. She pressed one key, then another. The notes were soft, intentional, a starting point. But no more came. Her music, once as natural as breathing, seemed to pause, as if waiting. She closed her eyes, letting her fingers linger on the keys, listening not to the room but to her own heart. In the quiet, a memory surfaced, the last night David was alive. They'd sat together at the church piano, hands side by side, crafting a duet from pure joy and spontaneity. He played wildly, even poorly, and she'd followed his chords with her own, laughing so hard tears blurred the keys. "I can't keep up when you're this erratic," she giggled. He'd grinned wide. "That's what love is, isn't it?" Now, alone, that same untamed happiness swelled in her chest, the chaos, the melody. In an instant, she knew her next piece. She began writing feverishly, the notes jagged and uneven, mirroring David's reckless playing. Then her own voice entered, layering over the disorder. Not to fix it, but to harmonize. She called it Harmony for a Restless Spirit Dash. This piece wasn't for a concert hall. It was for memory. She'd premiere it in the chapel where David had once listened, eyes shut, hands clasped. That weekend, under the warm amber glow of dusk, she stepped into the old church. The pews held only a handful of familiar faces. Students, friends, a few nurses who'd once worked alongside her in the cafeteria line. No cameras, no microphones. Just creaky floors, wooden benches, and a piano tuned just enough to sing. She sat in silence, then began. The music was raw, vibrant, even whimsical at times. It veered and twirled, played with rhythm, slipped into tender moments. It defied convention and created its own. The small audience wavered between tears and smiles, and that was the intention. This was a life, not a lesson. A love, not a monument. At the final cadence, she let it linger, unresolved, its echo hanging in the rafters like a voice still whispering from another room. She stood, bowed her head, not to the crowd, but to the empty seat by the altar. Then she walked away, leaving behind the silence she'd once been forced to carry. And the world, at least the part that mattered, kept listening. Spring arrived with a fragile promise. Birds finding their songs, leaves stirring from slumber, and daylight stretching longer into the evenings. Harmony Conservatory, once a fortress of untouchable prestige, now thrummed with something warmer, more human. It wasn't proclaimed with banners or speeches. You felt it in the hallways, where students paused to hear each other's music instead of rushing by, where even the silences seemed to hold their breath in anticipation. Sophie sat under a budding sycamore in the courtyard, jotting notes in her composition journal. Her hair was loosely pinned, the breeze teasing strands free like a playful child. Around her, voices ebbed and flowed, students chatting about melodies, motifs, and weekend plans. She didn't intrude. She listened. The music woven into human connection often spoke the loudest. She was crafting a piece for the graduating class, still untitled, but with a phrase scrawled repeatedly in the margins. What we leave behind must outshine our ovations. She closed the journal as footsteps approached. It was Noah, her son, back from deployment, his military uniform swapped for a casual button-down and jeans. Strength defined his posture, but his eyes held a gentle warmth that deepened as he drew near. "Mom," he said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "Noah," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He sat beside her on the bench, their shoulders grazing. They sat in silence for a while, the wind speaking for them. Then he reached into his pocket and handed her a folded program from her Carnegie Hall debut. She smiled softly. "I didn't know you kept this. I watched it from my bunk," he said. We crowded around a single laptop. I've never heard a group of soldiers fall that silent. Her throat tightened. "You should have been there with me." "I was," he said, "just not the way we imagined." They lingered together a bit longer before he asked, "Do you ever think about what Dad would have said?" She gazed at the blossoms unfurling on the treetops. "No," she said softly. "His voice is in every note I write. He's never stopped talking to me." Noah nodded, then stood. "Dinner tonight? Everyone's dying to see you. They've all seen the videos, you're practically royalty now." She laughed, her fingers brushing his sleeve. "I'll come, but only if they remember I was just the woman scrubbing dishes when you were born." He grinned. "They know. That's why it matters." That evening, in Noah's cozy apartment, surrounded by laughter, steaming dishes, and the clatter of forks amid shared stories, Sophie felt something rare, grounded. Not static, but rooted, like a tree finally at ease after bracing for endless winters. Later, when she returned home, a note waited on her piano. No envelope, just her name scrawled across it. Inside, a brief message from James Carter. "The board voted tonight. Auditions will be blind starting next semester. No photos, no names, just music." She closed her eyes. It had taken years, generations even, but at last the gates had swung wide. The next morning, she stood before her class of first-year composers. They watched her eagerly, pens ready, eyes bright. Some had grown up hearing her name in school programs. Others had only recently stumbled across her through a concert clip or a friend's music book, but all knew she was unlike any other teacher. She turned to the chalkboard and wrote one word in bold, clear letters. Voice dash. What does it mean to you? She asked. A girl in the back raised her hand. It's the sound you make. Sophie tilted her head. That's part of it. But it's more, it's who you are, your purpose. All the things they said were too odd, too quiet, or too much. She circled the word, then faced them. This week, I want you to write something only you could create. Not what you think a composer should make. Not what sounds polished, but something your heart alone could pour onto the page. A ripple of hesitation passed through the room. She smiled. I know it's daunting. That's how you know it's real. After class, as she gathered her things, a quiet boy lingered by the door. His name was Caleb, always sitting in the back, rarely speaking, constantly doodling in his notebook's margins. Ms. Bennett, he said softly. Yes. I wrote something, but I'm not sure it's any good. It's not typical. She turned to him, giving her full focus. That's perfect, she said. Typical never made anyone stop and listen. He stepped closer, offering a crumpled sheet of manuscript paper. She smoothed it carefully and read. At first, it seemed chaotic, offbeat rhythms, shifting time signatures, abrupt dynamic changes. But as she traced the measures, she saw it. A pulse, a rhythm of life. The piece wasn't flawed, it was fearless. This is remarkable, she said. He looked stunned. Really? It's not done, she added. But neither are you. That's what makes it beautiful. For the first time that semester, he smiled. As Sophie strolled through the corridors, students greeted her with quick hellos. Some dipped their heads in quiet respect, while others paused to share a melody, a question, or a spark of inspiration. To each, she offered the same gift: her full attention, her steady gaze, her unwavering faith in their potential. In the recording studio, she met with Lily again. The recital was just days away, and Lily's face was pale with anxiety. What if I blank on the notes? She asked, voice trembling. Then let the silence speak, Sophie answered calmly. What if my hands tremble? Let them tell your story. Lily blinked, surprised. Is that okay? Always, Sophie said. Especially here. That evening, Sophie sat at her piano once more. Her piece for the graduating class was finished at last. She named it What Lingers Dash. It opened with a single note, held almost too long, creating a quiet tension, followed by another, soft and wavering. The melody that emerged was delicate, built on intervals that barely brushed against each other. As it unfolded, it gained strength. Instruments joined gradually: flute, cello, then strings, each entering cautiously, like voices rediscovering how to speak. In the final measures, the piano returned, not with grandeur, but with quiet elegance, enveloping the others in warmth. It closed not with a flourish, but with a murmur, the kind that lingers in a room long after the lights dim. Sophie eased the piano lid shut. Outside, the breeze stirred again, scattering petals through the streets. And somewhere far off, in another city, another country, a child perched on a piano bench, hands poised hesitantly over the keys, eyes fixed on a screen playing Legacy Dash. They took a deep breath and started to play. The performance hall glowed under the soft evening light, its golden fixtures and ornate columns wrapped in the hushed excitement of a rare night. This wasn't just another spring concert. It was the first under the new blind audition policy. No names on the programs, no bios beneath the pieces, only titles, only music, only truth. The lobby of Harmony Conservatory hummed quietly, but not with the usual competitive tension. Instead, there was a gentle reverence. People gathered not to judge perfection, but to embrace raw honesty. At the center of this change was a woman seated alone at the balcony's edge, hands resting in her lap, her sharp eyes taking in the crowd. Sophie Bennett wore a simple black shawl, her hair elegantly coiled, a small silver locket resting against her collarbone. She'd arrived early, not for praise or attention, but to listen deeply, completely, with an ear for the heart behind the notes. That had always been her strength, hearing the soul in the music. The lights softened, the crowd stilled, and the first note rang out. No introductions, no names, just sound. A girl in the third row caught her breath, recognizing the theme, Lily's piece, one that had languished in a folder for years until Sophie insisted it deserved to be heard. It began tentatively with faint, dissonant intervals so soft the audience leaned in as if the music might slip away. Then came a shift, bold, unapologetic, almost wild, as if the notes no longer cared who approved. When the final chord struck, a lingering, aching dissonance that didn't resolve, a stunned silence followed. Then, like a rising tide, a standing ovation swelled. Lily stepped from the wings last, hands shaking, eyes wide. She didn't bow dramatically. She stood there, dazed, as if grasping for the first time that the world had truly heard her. From the balcony, Sophie's smile was subtle but profound. In that moment, she felt David beside her as he'd been in their old church pews, no words needed, just his presence, his quiet pride. The concert continued, unfolding like a musical journal. One student's piece, inspired by her grandmother's lullabies, wove breathy flute harmonics with somber chords. Another played a jazz-tinged sonata, reflecting his mixed heritage, shifting between rhythms like a conversation between cultures. Each work was its own universe, distinct and unrepeated. During intermission, voices stayed low. No one debated technique. They spoke of emotions, of connections. The music had transcended notes, it had become storytelling. Backstage, the atmosphere crackled with energy. Students embraced, tears streaming. Faculty murmured in quiet wonder. Even the critics, notorious for their sharp pens, lingered in the halls, unsure how to capture what they'd just experienced in words. Sophie slipped backstage after the final curtain, instantly enveloped by a crowd. "Miss Bennett, I can't thank you enough. You gave me the courage to sound like me." My dad heard it from his hospital bed. He said it felt like absolution. She absorbed their words like a tree soaking in sunlight, not as praise, but as fuel for something ancient, something still growing within her. Later, back in her modest home, she lit a single candle and sat at her old upright piano. Her fingers hovered above the keys. She didn't play, she listened to the echoes of her memory, to the voices she'd helped set free, to the quiet spaces between applause. Her phone buzzed softly on the windowsill. A message from James Carter. "Tonight was groundbreaking, Sophie. You've transformed more than this conservatory, you've redefined what genius means." She didn't respond. Some truths were too deep for words. Instead, she opened her notebook, now heavy with pages both old and new, and flipped to a piece she'd begun long ago but never completed. It had no title, no structure, just fragments, a haunting two-note motif that returned like a heartbeat or a memory. She picked up her pencil and started writing. This time, she didn't write from pain, longing, or the need to be heard, but from a new place, one she'd never explored before, completeness. The next morning, the city paper's front page ignored politics, scandals, or commerce. Instead, it featured a single image, a young girl in a plain black dress beneath stage lights, her fingers clasped over her heart like a prayer. The headline read, "They played what the world had forgotten." Below, in smaller print, "Thanks to the woman once overlooked." Sophie spotted it on her way to the corner store. Tucked between apple crates. The shopkeeper handed her a copy, eyes gleaming. "You've given the city its heart back," he said. She only smiled. That afternoon, she met with the summer cohort, a group of new students. They sat on folding chairs in a room still smelling of fresh paint, donated instruments neatly lined against the wall. None wore formal attire. Some hadn't yet learned to read music. One girl brought her toddler brother. Another sketched staves on notebook paper. Sophie stood before them in her gray cardigan and scuffed boots. She skipped introductions and resumes. Instead, she played a single note on the piano and turned to them. "What do you feel?" Silence settled. Then a boy whispered, like someone's tapping at a door. Sophie's smile widened. "Then open it." And just like that, the room sparked to life. No one critiqued, no one corrected. They played what came naturally, fingers fumbled, chords clashed, but beneath it all shone something vibrant, something true, something fresh. Sophie stepped back, arms crossed, watching the next generation find their voices, note by quivering note. Outside, golden light streamed through the windows in long, radiant bands. Inside, in that humble room, a quiet truth took root. Genius wasn't about perfection. It was the bravery to speak unprompted, to play uninvited, to trust that your story deserved its sound. And now at last, the world was listening. Summer sunlight stretched wide and slow across the city, gilding rooftops and casting long shadows that reached for the horizon like weary hands at rest. At Harmony Conservatory, the windows glowed with dusk's warmth, and inside the recital hall, a stillness settled, not the hush of disinterest, but the sacred pause of people awaiting something they didn't yet know they needed. On stage stood a lone piano, unlit, unadorned, a weathered instrument in a room that once dismissed such simplicity. The seats were filled not with patrons or critics, but with everyday souls, former students, custodians, retired nurses, security guards, cafeteria workers, young composers, kids who'd seen her videos on phone screens in bustling kitchens. Some wore suits, others sandals, all carrying an unseen thread, the memory of how this began. Then she entered, Sophie Bennett. No fanfare, no prelude, just the soft tread of her steps across the stage, the faint rustle of her skirt, her frame carrying both age and acclaim with quiet poise. Her hair had silvered into graceful wings. Her eyes held a depth like a calm sea at dawn, still, yet boundless. She sat at the piano, lifted the fallboard with careful hands, and let her fingers rest lightly above the keys. She spoke once, her voice soft but clear, this is for those never invited to play. Then she began. The first note fell like a pebble in a still pond, gentle, rippling, brimming with quiet strength. The melody unfolded not with pomp, but with memory, like walking through a life, room by room. Each phrase opened a door, the church piano, the tired cafeteria, the rejection letter, the shaky first audition, the late-night practice by candlelight, the weight of grief, the cheers of strangers, the trembling voice of a student who'd nearly given up. Woven through it all was David's laugh, his off-kilter improvisations, his hand over hers on a cold key, Noah's tears watching her from a distant screen, the warmth of the locket against her chest when her name was called as a national honoree. The piece broke from tradition. It rose and fell like a human breath, steady, flawed, deeply real. There were pauses where others might have rushed. Silences that urged the audience to turn inward. At one point, she held a single chord, her hands hovering as its resonance faded. A child in the back whispered, "She's not finished." And she wasn't. The final movement returned to a theme no one knew but all felt, the essence of every silenced voice, every locked door, every quiet yes spoken against a chorus of no. Her hands moved with the wisdom of years and the unspoken strength of endurance. She no longer played for validation. She played because the world had finally grown quiet enough to hear. The last note arrived. Not with flourish, but with grace, a faint harmonic, barely there. Then silence. She lifted her hands, letting them rest in her lap. No one clapped, not yet. They lingered in the space she'd created. Then, one by one, they stood, the applause rising like a gentle wave, filled with reverence, release, and awakening. Some wept openly, others pressed hands to their hearts, a few stood with bowed heads, as if she'd played a prayer, not a piece. Sophie rose, nodded once, and stepped off the stage. But the music stayed, not in the air, but in them. Outside, street lamps blinked on, one by one. The night was warm, scented with jasmine and raindamp pavement. As Sophie stepped into the stillness, a small group waited on the steps, former students, young parents, budding composers. They didn't speak at first, forming a quiet semicircle around her, drawn like stars to a quiet gravity. A girl stepped forward, no older than 12, her dress rumpled, sneakers caked with mud, but her eyes blazing with recognition. "Miss Bennett," she said, voice quivering, "I want to be like you." Sophie knelt slowly, placing both hands over the girl's. "Don't," she whispered. "Be you, that's where the magic lies." The girl nodded, tears falling freely. Next, a man in a wheelchair rolled forward. He'd once played in a youth orchestra, lost his hand's mobility in an accident, and hadn't attended a concert since. His voice cracked as he said, "You reminded me there's still music inside me even if it stays locked in my heart." Sophie smiled, touching her own chest. "That's where it starts." Later, as the world hushed and stars flickered into view, Sophie returned home. The lamp on her piano cast a soft amber glow. She poured a cup of mint tea and sat at her aging, slightly out-of-tune upright, opening the notebook that had been her companion through it all. She turned the pages, whispers at dawn legacy harmony for a restless spirit what lingers, and reached the final, blank page. She didn't reach for a pencil. She simply gazed at it. Then, slowly, she closed the notebook and whispered over its cover, "It's not mine anymore. It belongs to them." She stood, switched off the lamp, and let silence settle over the room. And somewhere, in another city, another country, a bedroom lit only by a flickering screen, a child watched her video again, felt the first trembling notes, and this time didn't just listen. They opened their own notebook and began. Because Sophie Bennett had done more than play. She'd built a world where no one needed permission to be heard, where silence wasn't a punishment but the start of a symphony. In a world that prized talent by lineage and polish, Sophie Bennett broke every unwritten rule. Without raising her voice, without pleading, she simply played. In doing so, she became the resonance of every overlooked voice, proof that quiet brilliance shines just as brightly. Her story isn't just about a woman at a piano. It's about what happens when the world finally pauses to listen. Because greatness doesn't always stride through the main entrance. That's all for today's tale on Top Stories Hub. Hit subscribe, leave a comment, and tell me what you'd like to see next.